today as we go through this very familiar parable. I think everyone has heard of this parable before. It comes up in even regular language as well. Talk about the Good Samaritan. As we go through this parable, I hope that we will be able to see ourselves clearly. So I'm going to start with going through the passage part by part, and then I'm going to go to the application of that passage. So we're going to go through this passage from the beginning. So on verse 25 it says, "On one occasion an expert in the law stood up to test Jesus. 'Teacher,' he asked, 'what must I do to inherit eternal life?' 'What is written in the law?' he replied. 'How do you read it?' He answered, 'Love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your strength and with all your mind, and love your neighbor as yourself.'" And so this passage actually starts at the very same place that we focused on last week. We talked about the great commandment, right? And these two commandments here, love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your soul, all your mind, and love your neighbor as yourself. And, I don't know exactly when, in comparison with the account in Matthew, where this happens, whether it happened before or after. But last week we talked about the Matthew account, and this week, when Jesus was asked what the greatest commandment was, this guy was trying to test Jesus. And Jesus, when he is asked this time, he does what he often does. It's like a classic teaching tool, right? When someone asks you a question, you respond by, what do you think, And so he says, how do you read the law? What is written though? What do you think it is? And this guy who was this expert in the law, this guy who spent his whole career was looking at the law and figuring out and interpreting what God meant. If there was anyone who would be able to answer this question, it was this guy. And so this guy was the guy who should know the right answer, and he does answer correctly. It says, love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your soul, all your mind, and all your strength and all your mind, and love your neighbor as yourself. And then Jesus affirms that, right? He says, you have answered correctly. Do this and you'll live. And it kind of could be the end of the story there. But remember the original question is this: what must I do to inherit eternal life? Right? That's the impetus for this question. It's basically saying, how can I go to heaven? What's the way to go to heaven? What must I do so that I can be seen as worthy, as righteous in the eyes of God, so that He will let me into heaven? And so this is important kind of to remember the original question, because it makes sense of the following statement. And it says, after this in verse 29, it says, "But he wanted to justify himself, and so he asked Jesus, 'Who is my neighbor?'" Right? Because he wanted to justify himself. He wants to confirm with Jesus and get his kind of approval, stamp of approval, saying that what he's done is good enough. Because he wants to be able to say, according to the checklist of Jesus Christ, the guy who calls himself a Messiah, I have done enough that I can earn my way into heaven. And then maybe he's a little bit uneasy about this. He's not sure that he's done enough. He's not sure if he lived kind of the life that would kind of get him into heaven, that he's not done enough. And so he asks this because, who is my neighbor? Because that word neighbor, that can be a really broad, generalized word. Did it mean the people that he lived beside, like physically lived beside, like the house next to me? Or did it mean like his colleagues, the people that he studied together with, that he was an expert in the law? Did it mean kind of his tribe of Israel, whatever that might be, that he was to love his tribe as himself? Did it mean his whole city, his whole nation? What did it mean? Because the bigger that circle becomes of who's my neighbor, who's in this circle, this Venn diagram circle that is my neighbor, the bigger that becomes, the more expansive it is, the more impossible this command becomes, right? Love the Lord your God with all your heart. That's hard enough. But if you're to love your neighbor as yourself, that can be easy if it's only the person that you live with or only the person that you care about. But the bigger that circle is, the more impossible it is. And he's asking Jesus, define this circle for me. Define who am I supposed to love, and I'll love that person. I think we ask ourselves too, right? Well, who am I? God says love everyone, but we can't really love everyone, right? We can't love every single person out there. So God, who am I supposed to love? Who are you calling me to love? And we want him to give us kind of this set answer. So who am I supposed to love as myself? And so Jesus answers this question, who is your neighbor, with this parable. In verse 30, it says, in reply, Jesus said, a man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho when he was attacked by robbers. They stripped him of his clothes, beat him, and went away, leaving him half dead. So we start with this initial setting of the situation. This man who was presumably in this story, because he's talking in a Jewish setting, a Jewish guy, right? He says, so this Jewish man was going from Jerusalem to Jericho. It was about 18 miles or almost 30 kilometers trek. And he says it was going down because it's actually physically downwards. Geographically, it's a little bit north and a little to the east. So east for you guys is there. So a little northeast, but physically, in terms of elevation, Jerusalem is higher because it's kind of on this little mountainous hill area. And Jericho is down by the Dead Sea Valley. And if you guys know anything about the Dead Sea, do you guys know that it's full of salt, right? Why is it full of salt? Do you know? Huh? All the water goes in, and it doesn't go out, right? Why doesn't it go out? Because it's actually lower than sea level, right? Because the water always flows down, right? So because it's lower than sea level, the water just goes there, and all the water evaporates, leaving just the salt. So when he's going down to Jericho, he's actually physically going downhill to Jericho, and it's a pretty, going from the mountain to a valley, it's a pretty mountainous route, and elevation-wise, it's a half a mile down. So he's going down through this very, well-used road from Jerusalem to Jericho, but it's a very mountainous road, and often because if it's mountainous, have you guys ever driven up a mountain or something? There's usually these small, tiny, winding roads, right? I remember when I went to this cave around the Sydney area, we had to go down this this little valley, and it was like the roads were winding so I got a headache because you had to focus so well, because if you just lose you have to focus for a bit, you're off the cliff and you're dead, right? And so I didn't want to die with my girlfriend at the time, which is now my wife. So you have to focus a lot. So these small winding roads down the mountain to Jericho for 30 kilometers, and because it's these this small winding road and very mountainous, and if you look at the kind of the area, it's very very barren as well. There were a lot of robbers and thieves that were in this area, so they would often come and rob the people that were going down this well-used road. And so this situation is a very common situation. Like this parable, it's like, yeah, I can totally relate to that. He's in Jerusalem telling this story. He said, that road from Jerusalem to Jericho, just pretend there's a man going down there and he gets robbed by thieves. And this is, okay, yeah, I can relate to this situation. Jesus is using this situation of brokenness, while very tragic, is also very understandable, very relatable, and something that people could really situate themselves into this, right? That they can see, okay, I can understand when a man is going from Jerusalem to Jericho by himself, that he can get jumped and beaten and left for half dead. And what can we relate this to? And there's so many situations that I could relate this, but I just wrote a little thing. I just paraphrased in terms of our context today. And so a young Indigenous girl ran away from her home on the reservation to go to Toronto. She got to the city where there was nothing there for her. The city beat her, took everything she had, and left her on the streets begging for help, leaving her spirit crushed and half dead. And I think we can see that, right? If we go to Toronto, there's a lot of people, especially Indigenous First Nations people, who are on the streets mainly because of the same reason, that they come to the city wanting to escape life on the reservation, and then that's why they're on the streets, usually struggling with addiction and mental health. And then we continue on in this parable. It says in verse 31, a priest happened to be going down the same road, and when he saw the man, he passed by on the other side. So too a Levite, when he came to the place, saw him pass by on the other side. So we see this priest and Levite come by into the story, pass this victim without helping him. They actually saw him and they went to the other side. These are people, Jesus chose these people, the priest and the Levite, specifically because they were the people in society, in their theocratical, hierarchy, that these were the people that were supposed to help someone in this situation. If there was a guy beaten on the side of the road, the best people to help you would be someone who's supposed to be this mediator, a priest, a mediator between God and the people of Israel, who was always surrounded by holy things and sacred rituals. And like the Levite is just another word for a priest, actually, because the tribe of Levi were the tribe of priests. And maybe this was like an off-duty priest or something like that. And Jericho was a priestly city, so there were a lot of priests and Levites that were using this road to travel between the two cities. And Jesus makes it really explicit that these people actually saw this man. Like geographically, if you look at the roads, they're not wide enough for people to kind of miss that. Like it's not like the 401 or something like that where they might be on the other side of the highway. It's this small, narrow road, and so it wasn't wide enough for them to miss the man. But actually, some of the parts of this road would actually be so narrow that to go on the other side of the road, they would probably have to go off-road to avoid this man that is by the side of the road. So it says in verse 33, But a Samaritan, as he traveled, came where the man was, and when he saw him, he took pity on him. See, this priest and this Levite came, and they saw him, and they passed by on the other side of the road. But the Samaritan comes. Now, what a Samaritan was doing, Jesus doesn't really say. Samaria was a nation to the north of Judah, where Jerusalem is situated, and it's this kind of surprise character in this story, right? Like people, when they're kind of following this story, a priest and a Levite, they're going. There's a crooked priesthood and this tribe of Levi, which has not been doing the job. That's why the country of Israel is where we are. It's because the people that God put into place to protect the broken and the vulnerable, they're not doing their job. So what they're kind of expecting is this poor rabbi comes, or maybe another a devout Jewish man comes. But instead of that, it's a Samaritan. Jesus is going for this shock value. Samaritans were from the nation of people that lived geographically what's called the northern kingdom of Israel, right? So, when David was king, he had the whole, kingdom of Israel, north and south, is all the 12 tribes of Israel. Later on, after David came Solomon. After Solomon, the two kingdoms split, and there was a northern kingdom and the southern kingdom. The southern kingdom was just 2 tribes, but the northern kingdom was these 10 tribes of Israel. And then later on, the Assyrians actually came and conquered that whole, kingdom. They destroyed the cities. They destroyed their capital. They sent off their people into exile, and then people from surrounding areas started to colonize and go into the nation of Samaria, and they started to repopulate the cities, intermarrying with the Jews that were there. And so the Jews that were there, they started to marry, and they started to worship God, but it was kind of like this hybridized worship that was their God plus how they used to worship their former gods, the idols. And because that even though they still worshipped Yahweh, the God of Israel, the Jews in the southern kingdom, because of the different ways they worshiped, the different elements they brought in that weren't from kind of, the proper Judaism, they saw them as unacceptable worshipers, these unacceptable people. Even though they were kind of these half-brothers and in terms of nationality-wise, they didn't accept that their temple sacrifices were valid. And so when Samaritans went down to the temple in Jerusalem, they actually refused to allow them entry to offer sacrifices. And so this racism between the Jews of the south and the Samaritans was so deep that, that when the temple in Jerusalem was first destroyed, Samaritans actually offered to help rebuild it, and they refused. Right? They refused to the help of these half-brothers because they thought they were, these tainted blood. And actually, when Samaritans, because they weren't able to go worship at the temple at Jerusalem, they built their own temple at Mount Gerizim. And actually, the Jews of the south went up and destroyed it in the 2nd century BC. So there's like this deep-seated hatred between these two nations because of their worship, because of their heritage, and there's no love lost. And so Jesus brings in this character. Of all the places in the world, he had to choose a Samaritan. And this Samaritan was traveling on the road. He saw this man and he took pity on him. He was the hero of this story. It's interesting to see that all three men saw the man. That Luke, when he writes, he says all three of them saw him. But not all who see are actually seeing. There are those who see what they want to see, and those who are seeing clearly. And there's this statement, we can only see things within others that we see in ourselves, we see within ourselves. We can only see things in others, within others that we see within ourselves. And I think that's what we see here in today's story. That the priest and the Levite, they only see this man's uncleanliness, that he's beaten because he's bloody, because that's what they see in themselves. That they're so focused on their holiness and their purity, and they're so concerned about it that they wouldn't even go near someone who's bleeding because they would be seen as unclean. It's interesting because, when I usually read this story and I think about, what the priest and the Levite are doing, for some reason, I always have this impression that they're going to Jerusalem to worship, right? But the account specifically says that it's the road from Jerusalem to Jericho. There's this direction away from Jerusalem. And so it's these people who have just finished their priestly duties, who have just went to their worship service, and they're leaving this place where they're so surrounded by the things of God, and they're going out back to their homes, and maybe they're just in a rush to go home. Maybe they just want to get back to their families that they've been away for a couple of weeks or maybe a month at a time. But they're not concerned about the well-being of this man. They're just worried about their own cleanliness, about being pure in the eyes of God. But the Samaritan, he sees them. He sees this man and he sees him clearly. Because the conclusion of the story and the point of the parable that Jesus emphasizes at the end is because he saw his neighbor in that man. He saw a fellow traveler in need of help. He saw someone who could just as easily be in him. It could have been him that was attacked, especially because he was a Samaritan. And then it says in verse 34, 35, continuing on, he went to him, bandaged his wounds, pouring on oil and wine, and then he put the man on his own donkey, brought him to an inn, and took care of him. The next day he took out 2 denarii and gave them to the innkeeper, saying, "Look after him," he said, "and when I return, I will reimburse you for any extra expense you may have." He used his own resources, his own time, his own mode of transportation, his own comfort, out of his own schedule to care for this man. And he even gave 2 denarii. 1 denarii was about a day's wage. So he gave him 2 days' wages so that he could care for this man, that innkeeper could care for this man. And said, even if it goes beyond this to take care of this man, I'm going to come back. I'm not going to just leave him behind. I'm going to come back and I'm going to pay the rest of that. He basically is saying that he took care of this man generously, sacrificially, and way beyond that what was expected of this man. And then Jesus asks to this expert in the law, after this story is over, which of these 3 do you think was a neighbor to the man who fell into the hands of the robbers? The expert in the law replied, the one who had mercy upon him. Jesus told him, go and do likewise. And so Jesus asked the man, the same man who asked, who is my neighbor? Jesus asks him, he does that teaching tool again, who then is the neighbor, based on the story that I told? And the expert in the law, he can't even say the word Samaritan, right? Because Jesus clearly said this was a Samaritan. He can't, like in his racism, in his hatred, in his bias, he can't even say the word Samaritan. He can only answer by a description of the man's action, the one who had mercy on him. And Jesus does the same and says to the man, the expert in the law, basically, you're defined by your actions. Go and do likewise. Your actions define you. The Samaritan was this unlikely hero, the one that no one expected, the one that was usually vilified and demonized, the one in any other story might have been the thief and the robber who actually beat up this man, but this guy was actually the hero. The person who is your neighbor isn't actually the one who you expect it to be. Even if it might not even be the one who should be your neighbor. The person who is your neighbor is the one who acts like your neighbor, who does the things that neighbors do. Even if everything else, society tells us that that person cannot be our neighbor, if they act like it, they are your neighbors. Now, what does this parable have to do with the way that we see ourselves and how we can see ourselves clearly? You know, I shared that statement, we can only see things within others that we see within ourselves. And there's another saying like that everyone you meet is your mirror. Everyone you meet is your mirror. What that's saying is that how you see the people around us, around you, is a reflection of yourself. If we want to see people clearly, then we have to see ourselves clearly. So there are 4 things in the remaining time that we should see about ourselves. And the first thing is we have to see our wealth. I don't know how many of you guys, if I was to ask you, are you rich or are you poor, would consider yourself rich. But that's a problem. You know, if we think we're poor, or if we think of ourselves as poor, as needy, as self-sufficient, then that hinders our way and our ability and our attitude towards helping other people, right? Today in our family time, one of our members shared that she helps people more now that she's working compared to when she is a student. Why? Because when you're a student, you're in this that starving student the mentality, right? And so we can be in that kind of attitude. We could be the poor person mentality that every bit of resource, every bit of money, every bit of time is really important to us. The average Canadian income after taxes in 2011 was $31,400. $31,400. That puts the average Canadian, this is the individual, in the top 2% of the world, right? The top 2%. The Canadian poverty line for a family such as mine, I have a family of 5, right? In my economic family, it's a family of 5. The poverty line there, which there's different kind of measures of poverty, but it's $41,212 for a family of 5. How many of you guys are single? You only provide for yourself? For the poverty line for a single person is $18,431. So if you're single and you're working and you make more than that, then you are above the poverty line. If you're a couple, your family income, $26,065, right? So I only put it up to there because the only other family that I know of that's here is a family of 3, which is Adrian's family, and a family of 5, which is mine. So $41,212. Last year, my net income was $49,291. That was on my tax line. So that put me on the top 0.64% in the entire world. And that's not even counting benefits. And I'll give you time. You guys can pull out your phones, pull up that website, globalrichlist.com. Enter in your annual, wage. There's 2 ways to measure your wealth, whether it's like assets or your income or your wealth. You can pull that up and just put in your number, and then it'll come up with where you are in relation to the world. I am richer than 99.36% of the world. It says something like, out of a planet of 8+ billion people, I'm the 35th million richest person in the world. It's pretty good, right? But so often, instead of looking at the people that I'm richer than, I look at the 335 million people that are richer than me. Instead of looking at the 99.36% that I'm richer than, I look at the 0.64% richer than me. And that's our natural tendency, isn't it? Maybe it's the Asian in me, but it's never good enough, right? Where's that last 1%? On that website, it also gives you a few statistics and comparison with the rest of the world. I make, on average, $25.67 an hour, while the average laborer in Zimbabwe makes 69 cents an hour. It would take an average laborer in Indonesia 51 years to make what I make in a year, meaning if roughly I make in a week what they make in a year, right? My monthly income would support the income of 143 doctors in Kazakhstan. If those stats aren't coming up again, just refresh and a new set of stats will come. So I did that once. That's 234 doctors in Malawi, 143 in Kazakhstan, 234 in Malawi. Go to globalrichlist.com and check out where you are, because it's really powerful stuff. There's other, measures of wealth. If you own a bicycle or a car, some mode of transportation, if you have a home that you live in, if you have a finished floor versus a dirt floor, if you have access to meat or some kind of protein if you're a vegetarian regularly, if you have access to medical or dental care, if you have running water and waste collection, then you are wealthy in comparison to the world. By the UN standards, 20% of the world is in absolute poverty, which means that they are living on $1, less than $1.90 a day. And that's just because they defined it to be $1.90. If their previous, I think, definition was $2, right? Then that percentage goes up. There are many things, and I know that a lot of us, we're not super well off, that we are not, comfortable, that we struggle financially, but there's a lot of things that we are, but one thing we aren't is we're not poor, right? We have to be able to see what we have in order to be thankful and to be able to share that and to have the attitude to share that with others. See your wealth. The second thing is to see our heart. Often what we have to see is just to see our heart clearly. If we are actually rich, then why is it that we feel poor? It's because of your heart. Matthew 6:19-21, it says, "Do not store for yourselves up for yourselves treasures on earth where moth and vermin destroy and where thieves break in and steal, but store up for yourselves treasures in heaven where moths and vermin do not destroy and where thieves do not break in and steal. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also." Where is your heart? Where do you store your treasures? Where do we store our treasures? And one simple way to do that is just to look at your spending, right? Pull up your bank account and your credit card statements. Where do you spend your money? Where do you spend most of your disposable income? In the past, in the previous generations, it was about possessions. Today we talked about how for millennials, it's often about experiences, that we value experiences more than possessions. It's possible because, in our generation, it's harder to gain the possessions of our previous generation, but we value those experiences over cars or, nice houses or, appliances, electronics, watches, clothes. Over those things, we look for the experience. And maybe it's a culinary experience you want, to eat good foods or the good sushi or whatever. Maybe it's a vacation or a travel destination. Maybe it's a certain kind of lifestyle experience that, you don't want to work all the time or you want to have this balance. But I urge you guys to test your heart. You can find about where your heart is in where you place your treasures. And it's not all about money, right? It's about your actions. That's what Jesus is saying. It's about your actions. Your actions show your heart. So finding out where your treasures is, finding out where your heart is, look at your actions. Where do you not just spend your money or just spend your time? What do you do? That's where your heart is. If your heart is at some place where there is room to cut back on yourself, cut back on your experiences, cut back on your possessions so that you can give to others, maybe that's the challenge that God is giving to us today. The third thing that we need to see is our poverty, our own poverty. We can see this in the actions of the Samaritan. Now, the Samaritan is a classic example of a marginalized person helping someone else that is marginalized. Often the reason why we don't help is because we can't empathize and we can't relate to the people and what they're going through. And when we have that empathy, when we have that relatable circumstance, when we have that relatable situation, we're more willing to help. One of the most disturbing images that I saw was that Syrian refugee boy, Elaine Kurdi or something like that, right? Elaine Kurdi. And one of the reasons why that was so disturbing was because my son at the time was a similar age. I had my second son who was around that age. And then you picture, and a parent will do that. They'll somehow substitute their own children for that picture, and then it just wrecks them. And so that's why I was so devastated and challenged by that picture. When we are able to relate to a situation, when we can understand, how as a pastor, there's this story of a pastor who committed suicide. I'm trying to understand that, and he has a young family and the pressures that are upon him, and you relate to that. And when you can relate, you're more willing to help. There's a story of Carl Thibault. Thibault's journey into homelessness and addiction began 20 years ago, and I took this from a CBC article. At his lowest point, he was living under the Gardner Expressway near the Spadina Avenue ramp. And how many of you guys drive by that? If you've ever been to a Blue Jays game, you've driven by that. Panhandling on the lakeshore to feed his cocaine addiction and coughing uncontrollably. A street worker steered him to St. Michael's Hospital, which is how he was recruited for a study, the largest ever in Canada, to demonstrate the principles of a housing-first approach to homelessness rather than the conventional approach of making treatment a condition for housing. So for Thibault, it was a life-changing experience. Today, he volunteers at a couple community centers where most of the people who drop in also rely on local food banks. Over the 2 years since leaving the streets, he's put up 3 other homeless men up at his apartment, 2 of whom he's also helped to find housing, not to mention supplying apple crisp. There was a picture of him making apple crisp, bag lunches and meals to neighbors on a tight budget. He says, I can't help it, says Thibault. I got lots of help from strangers helping me out, so I've got to give back. Arthur Brooks wrote a book called Who Really Cares? And it says, while poor people are less likely to give money to charities and individuals than rich people, when they do give, they give away more of their income. The rich give away about 3 to 4% of their income, whereas the poor tend to give away about between 4 and 5% of their income. This is the highest stratus of society, and then the lowest. Both give, this is important for us because most of us are in between there. Both groups give away significantly higher proportions of their income than middle class families. So we are lower than the 3 to 4%. Poor people are also more likely to give homeless person food or money than rich people are. Compassion, when they look trying to find out the reason, compassion may account for some of the difference. Psychologist Paul Piff performed a lab experiment in which participants played a game in which they were given 10 credits, which would be later converted into cash, and invited to consider, why don't you give away some of your credits to strangers? People of the lower socioeconomic status were inclined to give away 44% more of their points than those with higher socioeconomic status. Piff explained, the main variable that we find consistently explains the differential pattern of giving and helping and generosity among the upper and lower classes is this feeling of sensitivity and care for the welfare of other people, and essentially the emotion that we call compassion. Basically, poor people were more compassionate, and therefore they were more generous than rich people. Maybe this is what Pope Francis talks about when he says, speaking of the church, is that we need to be evangelized by the poor. When we see our own poverty, we can empathize with the poverty of others. And it's not just material stuff. Last week I talked about some of the definitions of how poor people define themselves. Shame, powerlessness, voicelessness, depression, anxiety, invisibility. These things that we experience on a regular basis as well. Without being material poor, we can empathize with the plight of those who are in poverty. The fourth thing, and I'm going to conclude with this, is we need to see our potential. It's not all bad news. Because if we just focus on the bad, then what can we do? But there is a great potential in us. We need to see what God has given us, the gifts that God has given us. As with the poor, helping the poor, when you give generously, it does something in people, right? It activates their own generosity. So when you give someone, $1 passing by versus, why don't you give them $50? How that will impact that person and how he uses that money, it activates his own generosity. The Samaritan, he gave generously, and so we must also give generously. And maybe that means you give to less people, but you make a bigger impact. We are all given this hope in Jesus Christ, and that's the potential that we have. Because of what God has done in us, we are able to give generously. That's what the gospel is, that we are given freely. And because we have been given His grace freely, we are called to give grace freely. As Jesus says, that last phrase, go and do likewise. That's what we are called to do. Let us pray.